Elsa Tulin's King's College London on the political recognition through democratization, the case of Turkey's Kurds.
So I'm a final year PhD student in the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies at King's College London, and my thesis looks at the contemporary Kurdish movement in Turkey from a social movement perspective. I have so many things to tell, but I mean in such a short time, it's so difficult to pick up a good argument in 15 minutes, but I'll try my best. I'll start with nations and people. I know these concepts are two very related concepts, but for many they're also somewhat very different notions. People in most languages is defined as a group of people, as a human group with similar origins, usually based on a shared history and culture. Though we do not quite attach to it a legal aspect. Nation, on the other hand, is rather seen as an entity endowed with legal existence, especially in the eyes of other groups, having the same quality, as evidenced, for example, in the formation of the United Nations, where nations define themselves as such and not as peoples. And particularly after the World War II, we've witnessed the gradual consolidation of nation states as a political legal entity or as a political legal reality of our times. So a state may take different forms and adopt different regimes, such as democracy, monarchy, principality, but it always represents a nation. Even movements that emerged against all kinds of states have strikingly followed this very logic. Particularly in the second half of the 20th century, for example, the ethnic revolts, protest movements, or revolutions, they've all appropriated the notion of nation. And in the majority of these cases, for instance, they have defined themselves as a national liberation movement, or were simply defined by others. So today, my talk is going to be about one of these movements, namely the Kurdish movement, and its objective to earn political recognition for Kurds through what might be termed as a non-territorial arrangement, as well as part of Turkey's democratization. Of course, we are no longer in a context of a post-war, nor do we live in the 1970s, when nationalist movements had reached their apogee. But as evidence in the Kurdish example, there are still some groups who continue to aspire to be counted in the community of nations, to be considered as a nation. And usually in the Kurdish example, but there are also other examples, the common point to all of them is that they believe they share a common history, a language, a culture, and there is a difficulty to establish a correlation between being a people and existing legally as such. So the question I wanted to ask for today's panel was that: would a territorial division be necessary for Kurds to achieve legal recognition, or would it be possible to achieve what I call, I'm sure other scholars have called this, I'm not able to give you a name now, but something called internal self-determination within the confines of the Turkish Republic. So most commonly, as you probably all know, the Kurds are considered to be one of the largest ethnic minorities in the world, and current estimates indicate 40 million or more souls without a state, scattered among Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and other parts of the world, including the former Soviet Union, Europe, and beyond. And the number of Kurds living in Turkey is estimated at close to 20 million of the total population of 75 million people. The archives in Ankara indicate that there have been officially 29 Kurdish revolts against several governments of the Turkish state throughout the republic's history. The most recent one being the one spearheaded by the Kurdistan Workers' Party (PKK) since 1984. Why? I mean, this is important though because it shows us that in one way or another, the Kurds have striven in a direction to, with the goal of achieving a political status, or to borrow Geller's terminology, a political unit of their own for themselves. So if at the beginning of my speech, if I lingered on the difference between people and nation, it was precisely because in Turkey the word nation is not used to define the Kurds. Although they constitute one of the largest minority in this country, their political and cultural identity has not been constitutionally recognized. A legacy of Atatürk, the Turkish constitution categorically denied the existence of the Kurds as a distinct nation. So having long deemed as their only option, the creation of an independent state to overcome this deficiency, Kurds have more recently shifted their objective. And by the year, and I'm doing this real quick, and I'm talking somewhat very fast, but because of the time constraints. But by the year 2000, the Kurdish movement's main discourse could already be seen to take the form of advocating democracy and self-determination within the confines of the Turkish Republic rather than outside of it. Thus, previous Kurdish demands for independence have gradually been replaced with goals for decentralization of local governments, education in mother tongue, and the liberty of organizing under the politically legitimate terms Kurd and Kurdistan. These two things, the decentralization of local governance, education in mother tongue, and being able to organize under the politically legitimate terms Kurd and Kurdistan are also based on my fieldwork findings with Kurdish activists in their regions in Turkey. So ultimately, during the last decade, in my opinion, we have seen a Kurdish movement which has largely evolved from being a primarily nationalist, secessionist, separatist, what have you, to being primarily a social movement within Turkey, which conceives the resolution of why I'm saying this because because they are conceiving the resolution of the Kurdish question, of the Kurdish problem, as part of together with Turkey's democratization and the establishment of the rule of law. So it seems to me that the Kurdish movement has come out having learned from the difficulties of its nationalist secessionist past to opt for a solution that could avoid perhaps a nationalist. It's hard to talk about these things nowadays because once again we have recourse to violence in the country, but this time that could avoid a national surge of pride on the Turkish side. So drawing on empirical evidence from my case study, what we can, I think, say with certitude is that the Kurdish movement does not wish to break away from Turkey, quite the contrary. My numerous interviews, for instance, have confirmed that the majority of Kurdish civil society refuses to secede from Turkey, to which they declare they fully belong. And these shifts in the Kurdish example leads to my argument, which is that that nationalist movements may evolve, especially when their initially stated goals are only partially met by the targeted state, may evolve from a strictly territorial conception of self-determination toward a non-territorial conception of the right to internal self-determination. How many minutes do I still have? I still have time?
You have
5 minutes?
minutes.
Okay. So, how is this going to be possible? I mean, despite transformations in Kurds' objective, in the Kurdish, as I briefly mentioned, it's still, and despite everything I've just said, it seems still quite difficult to wholly grasp, to wholly understand the dilemma in which the Kurds find themselves. So both without a state of their own and without a democratic or constitutional framework that could potentially guarantee the rights of their future generations. I mean, it can be said that the Kurdish movement in Turkey, in the form of People's Democratic Party, for those of you who are familiar with the political context of Turkey, but also many other, civil society associations, special purpose associations, and human rights organizations, they place the constitutional recognition of the Kurds at the core of their political agenda. So, contrary to what we have seen in Catalonia, for instance, before the last elections, they do not require that a Kurdish nation be written in the constitution as such, per se. I mean, they say, on the contrary, they demand that all references to ethnicity be removed from the existing Turkish constitution. So you see a little bit like how this is such a balancing game, but which remains fragile all the same. So on the one hand, in spite of all these, especially let's say from 2011 through 2015, it's still, I mean, despite everything that has happened in this direction, through for Turkey's democratization, etc., and Kurds living there, it still seems unlikely that Kurds will abandon their desire for independence forever. So, and what is more important, what is even more important is that every time there is a deadlock in the political debate regarding the Kurdish issue, we observe violence, recourse to violence on both sides of the conflict. So the argument, and after that, right after that, we actually there's this argument that that a civil war will ensue. So such ambivalences has led me to this conclusion, which is that an initially nationalist-oriented movement may incorporate in itself two completely opposing paradoxical realities. So the Kurdish will to secede from Turkey, something which can be found in the DNA of all Kurdish national movements, may overlap with their desire to remain part of the same entity by spearheading, because this is not something achieved, but by spearheading a movement that has more of a social twist to it against the state. So therefore, although officially the Kurds do not claim to for an independent Kurdish state, still the movement's nationalist dynamics seem unlikely to disappear completely. So on these grounds, I think the length of the conflict will determine, will have an impact on both of these arguments. So whether in favor of Kurdish separation from Turkey or living together with Turks. So the arguments for separation countless and more or less justified. But the arguments for Kurdish unification, in terms of, I mean, they also revolve around, notions of democracy, education, and mother tongue, etc. But at this point, let's also remember that when it comes to, different ethnic people's national problems, it's not always the most rational choice that prevails. So we'll see. And if I have another minute or two, maybe I just wanted to.
No, half a minute. So
half a minute. So I just wanted to.
Concluding statement.
Concluding statements that all. We can. I believe that we can't look at this. We also have to look at the bigger picture when addressing the Kurdish issue, especially the changing regional geopolitics. All the conflicts that are currently affecting the region have direct implications on the Kurds. They are very deunifying, so they essentially aim to rip apart various ethnic, linguistic, and confessional entities.
Okay, let's leave it there.
So this picture also.